Imagine taking your brand new off-road marketed SUV down a legal off-road trail and then receiving a letter saying if you do it again, you could receive fines up to $5,000 or 6 months in jail.
Well, Case, that's exactly what happened to a person out in Utah when he took his Subaru Crosstrek down a trail marked four-wheel drive when he thought his car did have four-wheel drive. Now look, in a lot of ways, the reasoning is completely sound, except it's also completely wrong. And in today's video, we're calling out the Park Service for giving a very black and white set of rules for a very gray-scaled problem, and we're also calling out the vehicle manufacturers for maybe marketing some vehicles as more capable than they really are. Case, why would the National Park Service in Utah even have rules about what kinds of vehicles you can and can't take down certain trails?
Well, they don't want people getting stranded on trails, doing something that's potentially dangerous for themselves, blocking the trails, maybe causing a very expensive vehicle recovery.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's about safety for the operator, safety for everybody involved, and the rationale makes sense. You wouldn't want someone taking a C4 Corvette through an area where only a Ford Bronco could make it.
In fact, the Park Service has a very black and white definition of what they consider a four-wheel drive vehicle. A four-wheel drive vehicle is defined as a sport utility vehicle or truck with at least 15-inch tire rims and at least 8 inches of clearance from the lowest point of the frame, body, suspension, or differential to the ground. Four-wheel drive vehicles have a transfer case between the front and rear axles that locks the front and rear drive shafts together when four-wheel drive is engaged. All-wheel drive vehicles do not meet this definition.
What the Park Service is saying, in my opinion, is largely correct. There are mechanical aspects of a vehicle you need to safely tackle certain off-road trails, but it's more nuanced than that, right, Case?
Yeah, and this vehicle, the Bronco Sport, is a good example of a vehicle that won't meet all of their criteria, but is in some ways, in a lot of ways, more capable than vehicles that would. Now, with some of the features that are on this Bronco Sport Badlands, like the center locker and rear locker, it's a decently capable vehicle. And this one doesn't have it, but you can also get it with some Falcon Wild Peak tires. And when this car actually hangs a tire, it doesn't really seem to struggle with that much at all. They also just came out with a Bronco Sport Sasquatch, which has got more suspension height, bigger tires, and even more off-road features. I mean, look, this is no Rubicon Trail, but this is enough to prove that this vehicle at least has capability enough to get up some reasonably challenging things. I mean, look at this little Bronco go. For a soft roader, it does pretty good. And it's fun. Of course, I'm intentionally taking it slow up this to try and make it as challenging as possible and to try and drive it carefully. But this has no problem tackling some reasonable terrain.
Now, that superintendent's definition of a four-wheel drive vehicle has a bunch of different components in it, so let's see how many components this technically all-wheel drive Bronco Sport meets.
Now, we have to give a little bit of grief about the criteria 15-inch tire rims, because that's a very strange way to talk about wheel and tire size. Doesn't seem written by an enthusiast. But here on the Bronco, we've got a 17-inch wheel with a 225/65 R17 tire.
And the weird thing about that, Case, is you would really never find a car that has a tire diameter of under 15 inches.
No.
And technically a smaller wheel with a larger sidewall is exactly what you want off-road, so I'm not really sure what they mean by that.
It's very vague.
The next criteria, 8 inches of clearance from the lowest point of the frame, body, suspension, or differential to the ground. Now, Ford will claim the Bronco Sport has well over 8 inches. We measured it just on our tape measure here, and we found the lowest point to be just about 8 inches. But the tough part about this definition is an incredibly off-road capable vehicle like the previous generation Colorado ZR2 had loads and loads of ground clearance and capability, but technically the lower shock mounts were right around 7-8 inches off the ground. So it might not meet that definition, even though it's got dual lockers and big tires and more capability than you ever need.
Now here's their next criteria. Four-wheel drive vehicles have a transfer case between the front and rear axles that locks the front and rear drive shafts together when four-wheel drive is engaged. And here's where it continues to get interesting, because this Bronco Sport does have a center locker that will make the front end and rear end wheels spin at the same speed. So it sounds like this should meet that criteria, but it goes on to say all-wheel drive vehicles do not meet this definition, and this is an all-wheel drive vehicle, so again, it's very gray.
Yeah, in case this vehicle, as you mentioned, has that ability, but it doesn't technically have a transfer case. It has a power takeoff unit from the front transaxle. And then you've got vehicles like the Jeep Cherokee Trailhawk, which had a proper low range with 2 sets of low range gears front and rear, but technically no transfer case. So an all-wheel drive vehicle, lots of them now have the ability to lock front and rear together, even if they don't have that transfer box. When I was doing some research for this story, what's interesting is different national parks have slightly different definitions of four-wheel drive vehicles, all along similar lines. The definition we gave at the start case was the definition the superintendent gave in the area where this guy could potentially be fined heavily. However, the Autopian, fantastic website, reached out and got some more information. And here is a quote from what they told them. The presence or absence of a 4 low gear, locking differentials, and the minimum clearance required are the primary ways Canyonland Rangers determine whether a vehicle meets the requirements for a use on a designated 4x4 roads in the park. Now that's an interesting case. A low range, you want to explain kind of what that does?
Well, a low range is a whole nother gearing that you can put your vehicle in that will amplify how much torque you can send to your tires. It works really well going off-road, but there's other vehicles that are very capable that don't have systems like that, like any electric off-roader up to this point.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. And then like this Bronco Sport technically doesn't have a low range, but a lot of manufacturers on their off-road trims will actually reduce the ratio of first gear to simulate a low range, and some of them do a pretty darn good job. I really think that this definition needs to be revised, and I think that the Park Service gives a lot of weight to four-wheel drive versus all-wheel drive. And the automotive community, in discussions online about this problem, have also given a ton of discussion about four-wheel drive versus all-wheel drive. But there hasn't been a lot of discussion or definition surrounding some aspects of an off-road vehicle which I think are more important, stuff like tires and recovery points and skid plates, because according to this definition, you could go out and buy a dually four-wheel drive truck on street tires and have that meet all their requirements. And that's a vehicle that could weigh 7,000-8,000 pounds, be terrible, miserable off-road, but still be allowed, where something like this Bronco Sport with skid plates and off-road tires and recovery points isn't. And I think that's where folks are getting a little stuck in the weeds.
Now, we understand why the Park Service would want to paint these vehicles with broad strokes, because they can't go through every single crossover on the market and determine whether they should or shouldn't be on these trails. But there are a lot of exceptions that make their criteria not make sense. Think about some of the electric vehicles that are out there on the market. Vehicles like the Cybertruck, like Rivians, and like the Hummer EV that don't have a low range, but some of them have lockers and quite a bit of off-road capability.
Luckily for you, we are not the Park Service, and we can provide a list of vehicles that we have felt after years of testing should be allowed to tackle some of the trails that the Park Service has deemed eligible for only four-wheel drive. So let's get to that list right now. So Case, you and I have both done a bunch of the trails actually that the National Park Service in Utah deem require four-wheel drive, like the White Rim Trail.
Yeah.
And from a difficulty standpoint, it's really not that hard, wouldn't you say?
No, it's similar to what we're doing now. It is a trail in name, but you could drive anything that's even remotely capable of off-roading down it.
But we did want to break down our list of vehicles we would recommend the Park Service to include, not only based on make and model, but also trim, because what we're finding in 2024 is, let's look at this Bronco Sport. This one we're in has a lot of off-road ability. The Sasquatch even more. A base model though, with the 3-cylinder and without that cool rear diff and without the skid plates, probably not as much.
Exactly.
Now there are certain vehicles that, regardless of capability, we would recommend the Park Service include on approved vehicle list, and they would be based on their definition, and that's vehicles like any 4Runner with four-wheel drive.
Oh, absolutely.
Any Bronco with four-wheel drive.
Yeah, the Wrangler.
I'm going to put Defender on there by Land Rover, if you have the right tires, and the Ineos Grenadier.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all extremely capable.
So those are examples of, regardless if you get a base Wrangler or Rubicon, it probably should be approved for that off-road use. But what about some crossovers and SUVs that you might not consider? Well, let's go down the brands. And if we didn't include a brand, it's not because we didn't forget, it's because a brand like Acura doesn't really make anything that we would feel suitable for regular off-road use.
Yeah.
So Audi used to, I think, be on this list with like the all-road products. We've driven the all-road stuff off-road. The all-wheel drive system is great, but based on their stock wheel and tire choice, along with lack of skid plating, we decided not to include any Audis on this list. Same thing with BMW, but we do have a couple of Chevrolets. So the Tahoe and the Suburban with the Z71 package. And why the Z71 case?
Z71 gets you a G80 rear locker, but it's not just limited to that rear locker, which is also very helpful.
You get added clearance and tow hooks and a low range and recovery points, those tow hooks, and tires, which is a big deal. So obviously tires can be changed, but we're just looking at stock vehicles from the factory. Ford, what we're in now, the Bronco Sport, specifically the Badlands and the Sasquatch, right?
Yeah, and of course, like we said, the full-size Bronco.
Yeah, full-size Bronco, of course. And then Expedition Timberline and Explorer Timberline. Those include trail control, 32-inch tall tires, and skid plates along with recovery points. GMC, now this is an interesting one because they have the AT4 lineup. Not all AT4s are built the same. So we feel that like something like a Terrain AT4 is kind of just a appearance package, but the Acadia gives you a twin clutch rear disc, skid plates, off-road tires, and recovery points. Same thing with the Yukon AT4. And going back to Chevrolet for a second, same thing with the Traverse Z71. It's in that same line. They're actually pretty good. Going off of Honda, Case, what does Honda make that could take some abuse off-road?
Well, the two newest Trail Sport models, both the Pilot and the Passport, are very capable, as we've proven with the testing that we've done. You get skid plates and a really capable IVTM4 all-wheel drive system.
Yeah, and like the Pilot even has a tow point underneath. These are proper, good, mild off-roaders, right? They're not going to do the Rubicon, but for what we've experienced in national parks, they are going to be just fine, even though they don't have a low range and they are technically all-wheel drive. Next up on the list, Case, the Hummers.
Yeah, the new Hummer EVs are very capable. And again, a vehicle that does not have a traditional low range.
But they have huge tires, 35-inch tall tires, especially with the off-road group. But even if you don't get the off-road group, they still have a lot of clearance, a lot of capability, and they are really good off-road for what they are. Hyundai, now this is an interesting one. So Hyundai has been coming out with all sorts of XRT off-road models, but we are not going to put them on our recommended list because from what I've experienced, a lot of them have a dual clutch transmission, and what happens to dual clutches off-road?
They overheat.
Yep, they're just not good at low-speed maneuvering. They also typically don't have recovery points or underbody protection, or for a lot of instances, any additional clearance. That really is just an example of a marketing package. Jeep. So Jeep is an interesting one. I'm actually not going to recommend like a base model Compass or a base model Grand Cherokee, but Jeep has an off-road variant on those cars called
the Trailhawk.
Yeah, and those generally across the board are pretty good.
Yeah, those are going to be capable enough to run, again, light trails. A lot of these vehicles that we're recommending, like you said, are not things that you're going to want to take on really extreme trails, but there's plenty of trails that they would be just fine on.
And look, if you look at something like a Compass Trailhawk, yeah, technically it doesn't have some of the things the Park Service would require, but I would take a Compass Trailhawk off-road over a 2500 diesel Denali on street tires, right?
Yeah.
So 100%, I think that should be included, and some of the trucks maybe not. We are focusing on cars in this one. All right, moving on from Jeep, we have Kia and the X-Pros. Same problem as Hyundai. They look great, they have some cool wheels, but they don't usually have tires or the clearance or the transmissions to take the abuse, so we're not recommending that. And what about Land Rover, Case?
Land Rover, we're going to go with basically anything that has a low range. So the Discovery with a low range, of course the Defender as we mentioned, and then any of the Range Rover products that have a low range have the potential to be very capable.
Yeah, really amazing four-wheel drive systems and good clearance. The problem is a lot of those vehicles are like the Evoque, which are more street-oriented with huge wheels, tiny tires are just going to lead to flats off-road. Plus, they don't have the underbody protection. So if you can find a Discovery that has a 4-low mode, any Defender, same thing with the Range Rovers with 4-low, you should be good to go. A Lexus, two models.
Yeah, the GX and the LX, of course, they're both very capable rigs on a trail.
Yeah, the GX 550, the new one, which underneath is essentially a Land Cruiser, and the LX, which underneath is essentially
a Land Cruiser.
A Land Cruiser, just what we don't get in the US. Mercedes.
Mercedes is going to have, of course, the G-Class and the upcoming electric version of the G-Class. But that's about it.
Incredible capability on those two models if you change the tires or get the Pro version of the G-Wagon. Really amazing off-road. It is worth noting those tires will need to be changed. Nissan, interesting one. So I wouldn't have put this one on my list a few years ago, but the new one's actually pretty good. The Pathfinder Rock Creek Edition. It's kind of as mild as I'm going to go on this list because it doesn't have some things I would typically want, but it does have good ground clearance and a good all-wheel drive and a good set of tires, a really impressive set of tires. That's why it's made it on the list. And Rivian
is going to make it on the list, whether you're getting the R1S, and we're mostly focusing on cars on this list, or the R1T. They're both going to be plenty capable enough for some light off-roading.
Even moderate or more than that, because they have clearance. They've got a great four-wheel drive system. I've said it, even though there's technically no transfer case, they are very good at what they do, and they've got a lot of clearance and recovery points, and they have an off-road package, which I would recommend, but even for light stuff, the normal one should be okay. Tesla, I know it's a truck, but we have to mention Cybertruck. People hate it, but our dual motor we have at the office does have dual lockers.
Yeah, mechanical lockers, and it is one of the better off-road EVs that we've ever tested.
It is, much to the disappointment of some haters, actually very impressive off-road. And Toyota, now this is an interesting one. So we talked about, you know, 4Runner, any 4Runner, any Land Cruiser is gonna be great off-road. Sequoia, specifically the TRD off-road model and Pro models are pretty good. Now I'm not gonna put the RAV4 TRD off-road on the list because it doesn't have really that much improvement over the standard RAV4, which is kind of disappointing off-road.
Like with some others, it's mostly an exercise in branding and marketing.
Yep, and then I'm also not going to include things like the Highlander or Corolla Cross. So that is my list of vehicles I would recommend the Park Service include on their list of vehicles, and it is a pretty specific list, and I think it needs to be, at least in terms of new vehicles, because something like a Grand Cherokee in base model form or in luxury form may be pretty poor off-road if it doesn't have a low range, but if you get a Trailhawk, it's actually incredible.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a lot of nuance here, and trying to make a blanket set of rules to determine whether one vehicle should or shouldn't be allowed on a trail just doesn't really work like we've shown. Again, a big dually diesel pickup truck that is wide, it's heavy, and it's got typically no lockers is going to be far worse off-road than the Cybertruck, which does have mechanical lockers, has quite a bit of clearance, and pretty aggressive 35-inch tires.
Even if it doesn't technically conform to their rules.
Yeah.
Heck, I would take this Bronco Sport over any dually off-road, and that kind of shows a problem with the Park Service argument. And lastly, we need to mention Subaru. We don't have a lot of experience with Subaru because they don't work with us. Now, from what I've seen, their wilderness trims have pretty good all-wheel drive systems and pretty good clearance, but they typically don't have a ton of underbody protection and really don't have much in terms of recovery points. So until we have more hands-on experience, I can't put those on my list. But folks, let us know what you think in the comment section below. As always, this has been Tommy
And Case.
Head over to alltfl.com and be sure to drop us a comment below.